let's start. Welcome to this talk on Spring Boot. My name is Stephane Nicoll. I'm working for Pivotal. I'm a member of the Spring Boot team. I'm also working on the Spring framework. And a tool that we'll see today that's called start.spring.io, you'll see what it is. So before we start, we have a lot of slides to cover, so I would like to ask a few questions first. Who's using Spring already? That's 75%, okay. Who's using Spring Boot? 30%, okay, good. So like I said, we have a lot of slides to cover. If you want to get in touch with me, there's my Twitter account there. So that was the you were in the right room slide, and that's pretty much about it. Okay. So if you want to start with Spring Boot, and basically the idea of this talk is no slides, I'm just going to code a very simple Spring Boot application. I'm going to showcase you also some of the new feature in Spring Boot 1.4. But if you want to get started with Spring Boot, and Spring in general now, one idea is to go on this site, start.spring.io, where you can generate a quick start project. So as you can see, you can choose the build system that you want, the Spring Boot version that you want to use, and by default, you'll get the latest one. Some metadata about your project, and basically, it's like a shopping cart. You're going to shop for dependencies. So you're going to add dependencies, you're going to add features to your application, and as a result, Spring Boot will do something meaningful for you if you don't provide any configuration. So for instance, you could say, I want to build a web application, I want to use JPA. I want to expose my JPA repository as REST endpoints. I need a database, so for now I'm going to use H2. And I'm going to use the actuator, which provides some DevOps-related features. And I'm also going to use DevTools, which provides features in the local environment. And then you click on this, and you'll basically get a zip of a project, an empty project, but configured for you with best practices. No code generation, by the way, so it's not generating any code, except a simple empty class, as you'll see in a minute. Then you can just open that in your favorite IDE and just get going, right? So I could do that, but instead I'm going to show you a different way to actually do the same thing. And instead of adding all those dependencies, I'm only going to add one, code some feature, and add more dependency, and then you'll see what happens when I'm adding dependencies to the project. So for this demo, I'm going to use IntelliJ IDE, but if you're an Eclipse fan or if you use NetBeans, they have similar features, so they have exactly the same kind of features in Eclipse and in IntelliJ, in NetBeans, sorry. So I'm going to create a new project there. I'm going to choose Spring Initializer, it's the default there for me. I'm going to call that Voxed and keep all the same settings. Right? You can see also you can choose a programming language if you want. And that's actually available right there as well in the web version. I'm going to say I want web. And only that. Next. Works for me. And then IntelliJ IDE will do everything for me, right? So contacting the service, getting the zip file, extracting the zip file at the location I've specified, and auto-configure the project in the IDE. So the next thing that you have to do is basically press this, and the application is starting. And all the Spring setup is done for you. So if we look at this application, it's really empty. There's nothing in it. As I said, no code generation. There's a simple app. We are going to go back on that in a minute. There's a configuration file, some placeholder for things. We'll see what it is. A test, and a build file. And that's it. Okay? So this is a web application. So I want to do some hello world kind of thing for Spring Boot. So let's create a web package there, and maybe a class called home controller. So for those, most of you are using Spring already, so you know about Spring MVC and how you can create easily endpoints using the annotation model. So I'm going to create a REST controller and with a simple action that I'm going to call home. And that action will be mapped on the root. and it's going to simply say hello Vox, right? Nothing fancy. So this is really my business logic. It's really a stupid business logic, but this is really what it is about my application. All the rest is infrastructure, right? So I'm going to press run there, and something will happen. So something is starting, right? And if I go on localhost 8080, I have an app. Okay? So if you use Spring and if you use Spring MVC, you know that there's a fairly amount of setup to reach the same thing. You need to enable MVC, you need to configure a few things, then you probably need to build a WAR file, right? Then you need to download Tomcat, install Tomcat, do something with it, then go in your shell to run a script to actually generate a WAR file, and then copy the WAR file to Tomcat. Of course, there are many tools in your IDE that shortcuts that, and some IDEs like IntelliJ IDE have integration with Tomcat, so you can do that directly, but still, you need to install Tomcat, you need to configure it. In this case with Spring Boot, what happens is if we go back on the build file, you'll see it's very simple. The build file has this really. It has two dependencies. One which is called Spring Boot Starter Web, and the other one which is always added automatically for testing support with the right scope, as you can see. So you're basically telling to Spring Boot, I want to build a web application. So Spring Boot will basically give you opinions at many levels. First, if you choose to take the Spring Boot Starter Web, you'll see there is no version in the dependency. That's very important. I'll explain that in a minute. You'll basically get everything to build a web application. Not crazy dependencies, right? Like not a ton of dependencies, but really the basic stuff that you need to build a web application. What do you need? In the Spring world, you need Spring MVC. You may probably want to use the validation API, and you need a container. So Spring Boot Starter Web is basically going to bring Tomcat, and we are going to configure it for you, embed it. So that's why you can press star on a simple main class, and you get a web application. So we are really back to the basics with Spring Boot. When you were in college or university and you had your computer science courses, I'm sure at some point when you learned about Java, you had to build an app with a simple main and then creating a jar file and put something in the manifest. Then you can run that jar file on the command line and it did hello world or something like that, right? We all did that. The idea is to keep the same simplicity, but with any application really. So think about it. If you want to debug this application, remember it's a web application, right? So remote debugging and waiting for the server to start up. You don't do that, you just press this, debug. It's a main class, okay? So it's not really fancy and you still have no idea how this works, for those who don't know what Spring Boot is. So I'm going to add a bit more feature and then hopefully it will make more sense what's happening behind the scenes. So this application is not really fancy. I want to, I said, use JPA and REST repositories to expose something meaningful, exposing some data and basically also allowing to update that data. So the first thing I need to do is I need to add more libraries to my application. And as you can see, there is a nice convention in Spring Boot, which is that prefix that you already see 2 times. Now we are going to add that one 2 more times. So I'm going to say I want to use data JPA, and I want to expose those repositories as REST endpoints. And I need a database, right? Spring Boot is not going to choose a database for you. We could have done that, and it probably would have been a mistake. So we try to have opinions that really make sense and that doesn't go in your way. And for things that we cannot decide ourselves, then you still have to make that decision. In the case of the database, it's probably obvious that you have to choose yourself. So I'm using H2 because that's enough for now. I could have added a driver to MySQL, PostgreSQL, Oracle, and you name it, and it would have worked pretty much the same way. So let's add some code to this application. I'm going to create a domain package now. And I have some class prepared for you so that I don't have to code that in front of you. Otherwise, it's really, really boring. I'm going to explain you what that does in a minute. Repository. Okay. So I have a class, a JPA entity. You probably all know about that. There's nothing fancy about Spring Boot. Spring Boot is not a new framework. It's built on top of Spring, and Spring is built on top of many things, many standards, like the JPA standards, for instance. So if you want to build a JPA application or JPA entities with Spring Boot, you'll just do what you do with any other system. And as you can see, there's no funky import there. It's just plain JPA. The repository is using Spring Data, and I'm exposing two such methods there. Who doesn't know at all what Spring Data is? A few? Okay, a few. So Spring Data is an abstraction to access data, and one of the things it does, you can see that it provides some shared methods, so it provides an abstraction. You can see that I'm extending from a CRUD repository there, so I'm going to have access to all kinds of nice methods that are going to be implemented for me automatically. And I can also, via this interface, I can also create search methods, and the signature of the method is going to infer the kind of query I want to execute. So the first query really, maybe I should go back to my speaker thing. There is a Twitter account that you can set on this speaker instance. I can search for a speaker with a given Twitter account. And because it's defined by Twitter, that means I'm looking for that particular field of the speaker entity. Because it's returning a single speaker, I'm expecting only one result to be returned. So if the search query returns more than one result, you'll get a nice exception with the detail that you expect. I can also return a collection, and I can return all the speakers that have the specified last name. This is very basic. This is like very sunny day. But my goal here is not to explain you how you can do things with Spring Data. My goal is to show you how Spring Boot helps you build an application and what it does for you on an infrastructure and configuration level. So I need some data in my database, so I'm going to use a feature of Hibernate. I could have used something else, but I'm just going to use that because it works for me. So import.sql, Hibernate is just looking for that on startup and just executes it. So still no config, right? Still in the IDE, no build system, no command line tool, nothing. So it's still there. And if I go here, I have a REST endpoints with my speaker objects. Okay? I can access to one of them, like you would expect, as a RESTful resource. I can also search for speakers, and you can see my two search methods have been exposed. And I can basically do this, which is calling the searcher I was showing you like 2 minutes ago. But what's important is you haven't configured anything, right? You got a behavior by default. So let's step back for a minute and basically explains what happens. Spring Boot has this concept of auto-configuration. So it's the same thing as a configuration in the Spring world, where you can define beans and add behavior to your app, configure your infrastructure, basically. Except that in Spring Boot, there is a condition framework that we've built where we can detect things. Like, is entity manager.class present in my class path? Is a specific class of the Hibernate jar present in my class path? Yes. Do you have any configuration in your infrastructure? Did you define an entity manager factory bean in your configuration? No, you didn't. So what you're saying is you added Hibernate, you added the JPA API, you didn't specify anything, but if you have Hibernate in your app, it's probably because you want to use it, right? So what I'm going to do for you, I'm going to initialize Hibernate. That's what happens, but it doesn't happen in one way. It's a sequence of auto-configuration. So if we go back a bit, if you want to use Hibernate, you need a data source, right? You need some way, some database, some way to access a database. So what Spring Boot is doing, back to MySQL, PostgreSQL, and Oracle, and whatever database you want to use, have you provided away the URI to the database? Have you provided a JDBC URL in your configuration? I haven't. Okay. So I can't connect to a database because you didn't specify any way to connect to a database. Is there an embedded database on the class path by any chance? Yes, H2 is there. Oh, well, but okay, it's the only option that I have, so I'm going to create a database in memory for you. So the nice thing about that is the minute you're going to have an opinion, so the minute you're going to say, no, connect to that database instead, so you're going to specify a property. I will show you in a minute how you can do that. Spring Boot will detect it and will change the behavior. It will actually take your opinion. It will take your configuration into account and will still auto-configure a bunch of things. So in the case of Spring Data, it's the same thing. Spring Data is on the class path. Hibernate has been started by a different auto-configuration. Okay, I'm going to scan repositories in the default location. Default location, by the way, for Spring Boot is this package and all the sub-packages. So basically, it's the package where you put your Spring Boot app. What's a Spring Boot app? It's a class with Spring Boot application. That's it. Of course, if you don't agree with that, there's a way to tell, no, don't scan that package, but scan those packages instead. You just add a component scan directive, and we will use that, obviously. So the thing I want to show you here is Spring Boot allows you to focus much more on your code and much less on your infrastructure. And two, it's also a way to try new things very easily. So if you don't know about Spring Data, if you don't know about Spring Data REST, or more importantly, if you know about Spring Data but you don't know about Spring Data REST, you can have some kind of repositories that you've built. You just add Spring Data REST to the starter for Spring Data REST to your app, and you'll get a default. You may not be happy about the default, then you can look in the doc and see how you can customize that. Okay, I have an app. What's the next thing I want to do for this app, which exposes very sensitive data, is to secure it, right? So if I want to secure it, what do I do? I'm adding a new dependency. And as you may guess, the dependency is called Spring Boot Starter Security. So let's do that. And what I'm going to do now is do nothing else and just restart this application. Boom. I have to log in now. So this is a different behavior that we have, a different behavior that we provide. If you're adding Spring Security in your application, it's probably because you want to use it, right? Otherwise, you wouldn't have it. What can we do by default for you? What can we possibly do? Not much, really, because configuration of an app is quite complex, but we can at least do something very basic so that you can get started and at least make sure that the thing is working, that Spring Boot is actually using it. So we are going to secure everything with basic authentication, and we are going to create a default user so that you can actually log in to your app. So anybody has an idea, just to see if you're still awake? Anybody has an idea what the user and password might be for that user? One at a time and maybe louder. Guest, no? Admin and what? Admin, no. Okay, so I got the right answer, and hopefully you didn't hear it so that I can make a joke. So the default user is user. And the default password, we didn't want to be responsible of you adding that starter in your app. Put it somewhere, forget about it. And then anybody can read our developer guide and know the default password and log in into your app, right? We don't want to do that. So what we do, every time the application starts, we log right here. Sorry. Come again. We log right here a default security password. So let me take that for you. and boom. So one reason we're doing this that way is so it's auto-generated at every restart. So every time you restart the app, the password changes. And it's also impossible to remember because it's way too long and too many different characters. The reason why we're doing this is we want you to fix that. We want you to be annoyed by that. Because that's not the same situation, right? It's okay to get started, but if you have a real app, you need something else. Right. So let's do that. Let's fix it. So you may think that, okay, if I want to fix it, then I need to go into Spring Security and read everything, and then I need to configure everything myself, right? This is not what happens. So the auto-configuration stage are really modular, where we detect some things, and we can actually detect your configuration and still auto-configure the rest. So I'm going to just do one thing. I'm going to say these are the users that can log in. So again, this is Spring Security. This is really nothing related to Spring Boot, so you don't have to learn anything new. For the sake of for the sake of the demo, I'm going to create simply 2 users, no fancy like JDBC store, LDAP or whatnot. An hero which has 2 roles and a user that has only 1 role. So let's restart this app and see what happens. The first thing you'll notice if we restart is that there is no password in the logs anymore, right? So we don't want to confuse you by telling you this is the password where it's not supposed to be used. And if I log in, then hero and hero, and I can log in. But I had to log in, right? So every other security setup that Spring Boot did for you, it still does it, but it does it with your authentication manager. Okay, so this is pretty much what I wanted to show you regarding how you can get started with Spring Boot. Obviously, there are many libraries, so if you go on start.spring.io, again, these are the things that we integrate with. By default in Spring Boot, there are also a lot of community starters now, things that the community has worked on integration on whatever. There's integration for Stormpath, for instance, KML, CXF, so there's MyBatis. So there's a lot of things going on. So I can't potentially show you all of that in 45 minutes, but keep in mind that you get pretty much the same experience. What I want to show you now is what Spring Boot brings, what features Spring Boot brings on top of the infrastructure. So what could possibly be added to any app regarding the type of app that you are creating. So if you create an app, whatever the app is, you need some way to administer it. You need to have some kind of configuration management system. You need to be able to debug the application when it's running. You need to check if the application is healthy. You need to retrieve some information about this application. You need to do that all the time. So we thought that since it was a common requirement, maybe Spring Boot can do something about that. And we did. I'm going to show you that in a minute. Just going to add a starter again. And that starter is called actuator. Don't ask me what that means. I always forget. Go on Wikipedia or something like that. OK, so if I'm adding that dependency, I guess I was too quick for IntelliJ to pick up the dependency. Right, that's better. So I wanted to show you one feature of Actuator. So Actuator actually exposes a bunch of endpoints, so web endpoints. You can also access that via the GMX domain if you don't have a web application. So by the way, you don't have to build a web application with Spring Boot. You can build any app you want. You can build a command line app. You can build a daemon. You can build whatever. But in this case, since I have a web application, it's easier for me to show you basically the web endpoint. And env is a way to read the environment of my app. So the settings, the properties, what kind of configuration I have defined in my app. And it doesn't work. I have a 403. I have access denied. Anybody has an ID why? Anybody? I can't access that resource. Why? Did I lose all of you or what? Okay. So this is an administrative feature. Okay? You don't want anybody to see that. You don't want anybody connecting to this app to actually see the inside of your app. So you need a role for that. What role could it be? Ah, finally, admin. So let's go back to our security config. This is what I have. I'm currently logged in with this one. So this is what I could do, right? And it will work. But I don't want to do that. I don't want to do that. Because my domain is to say that hero is actually the super user. It's not admin. It's hero for whatever reason, whatever business decision or technical decision that makes sense to you. You want that role to be used. You don't want Spring Boot to dictate what the administrator role is. It can provide a default, fine, and if you're happy with the default, fine, it will work out of the box. But if you're not happy with that, you could be able to change it without having to change your decisions. I'm going to show you that, but before I do, I'm going to add one more dependencies to show you the development features of Spring Boot. It's called DevTools. It's something that you only add locally. So this is something that's only used while you're developing your app. And when it is present, Spring Boot will do something for you. So let me add one dependency and restart my app. OK. So small change here, change of mind. I want to show you something else before. I'm accessing a page that doesn't exist. And as you can see, you already saw it before. I'm getting this default error page that you can, of course, customize. But this is really a stupid default error page that's good enough for now. And it's telling you, didn't work, this is what the error is. And probably you want something better for a 4.4 page, right? So this resource is not found. So I'm going to use DevTools to show you how it can be done without restarting your application. So I have this plugin here, Live Reload. It's a system that we don't develop. It's another company that creates a Live Reload client and a Live Reload server. So the idea is it allows the server to basically send command to the browser, like do this, do that, refresh, scroll the page or whatever, so that the server can basically instruct what the browser to do, which is really a good thing in development mode. The client is free, so you can install that in your browser, whatever browser you're using. They have a client for it. You can install it for free, and whenever Live Reload detects a server, you can basically just click, and it will say connected. So the first thing that DevTools does is starting a very simple Live Reload server for you, and we'll see what that does. Okay, so I'm back with my error page. I'm going to create a directory called error, and I'm going to create a file called 4.4. Right? Something happens. Have you seen me restarting the app? I didn't. So the second thing that DevTools does, and it's not rocket science, right? You could do that yourself. The second thing that DevTools will do is it will detect when there is a changes in your project, and it will tell the browser refresh. That's easy. But we'll do something much more complicated now. Let's go back to this error page. Okay? You need admin. I don't want admin. By the way, I'm sure that I left admin. I didn't, otherwise it would have crashed. Okay, I didn't. So let's go into that configuration file. You've already seen create your own config. Spring Boot will detect that and will react to it. Use your configuration rather than the default that it provides. That's one way to customize the way the auto configuration works. Another way is to write some configuration. So each auto configuration exposes a set of configuration key, like in a property file, and you can define them to tell Spring Boot, don't use that value, but use that value instead, or maybe enable that behavior, or disable that behavior. There's plenty of things you can do, and we expose a bunch of keys, a lot of keys in the system. So now I need to find the key that customizes the role for the actuator endpoint, right? Which is admin. I don't want admin, I want hero instead. So what do you do when you need to do that? You probably Google it, right? Stack Overflow, maybe. I heard someone was reading the doc. It happens. We still need to find him, but but it happens. We want to do something better in Spring Boot. And in Spring Boot, we have built a very nice integration in the IDEs. Again, IntelliJ IDE, Eclipse, NetBeans. I want to search for something, so why don't I type that in the IDE directly? Okay? And if I do, I can see that actually in 1.4 we've allowed multiple roles. So this is the feature, this is the property that you add up to 1.3. In 1.4 we allow you to specify many roles, not only one. So you can see one of them is deprecated now. And you can see the default value. So I'm going to say that, I'm going to say hero. Bam. This is code change. This is not a template anymore. So DevTools does much more than that. DevTools is actually looking at your code, figure out that something in your code has changed, and do what's necessary to refresh the application with those changes. So by just adding that property, I was able to log in. And just to show you it's no magic, I'm going to comment that out and rebuild, maybe. OK, and I'm back. And hopefully back again if the live reload thing works. Yes, OK. So environment endpoint. I can see many things. I can see system properties, maybe increase that a bit. My environment on my system. But more importantly, I can see this, right? So I can see exactly the configuration that I have specified in this application. I also see where it's being defined. And it's a REST endpoint. So if you want to know more about something, you would just type this, and you'll get the answer. So if you have a management endpoint, you want to make sure that all your apps in your system are running with Java 8. You just do an HTTP GET in whatever monitoring system you have, and bam, it works. OK, you can do more than that. If you're Spring fans and you want to know what beans are defined, you can do that. Show me the beans in the context. You can see my application. You can see actually my security thing somewhere, security config. You can see actually where it's being defined. For web fans, we have mappings. Tell me the mappings, the MVC mappings of this app. We can find our root mapping on this method. You can trace requests. So you can basically get what kind of request you get, request header, response headers, whatever. you can get some Earth information about the application. Is this application alive? And you can see that now there is 2 being exposed. And this is auto-configuration on top of auto-configuration, right? So at the first stage of the auto-configuration we've seen is creating a data source for you, starting Hibernate, whatnot. Then later, those components will detect, oh, there's a data source in the system. So I'm going to add an indicator that tries to open a connection to the system and make sure it's still alive. Same thing for the disk space. That one comes by default, and I'm just going to add a new one for you. So I want to add a new one. How do I do that? It's very easy. So I'm going to create a new bean right here. New config. I'm going to expose an Earth indicator. That's an API in Spring Boot this time, since it's a feature of Spring Boot. And I'm going to say something very smart, you'll see. It's very, very smart. So I'm going to say the application is up, or the application is down. And you see that you can add some details. You can add also a stack trace, and then we will display the stack trace nicely for you. And if I do that, boom, I have it. Simple as that. And it's up now, so if I refresh, it's down. It's down, it's down. Eventually it will go up. So the code there is just to mention that that bean that you define, every time we call the health endpoint, we're going to call you. And you'll get a chance to say, okay, some of my remote service is down, it doesn't behave properly, or it is in an unknown state. Then you can use the status up there. Again, as a monitoring infrastructure, it's very easy. You just do an HTTP GET on this URI. Any Spring Boot app that has the actuator, it will be the same URI. And the JSON that comes out of it is also the same. And then you can just parse the JSON in your management system and figure out what to do with it. You can have also some nice info, which is empty. It used to be empty because I did that talk many times, and prior to 1.4, what I was saying is we have no opinion about what the info of your application might be. And over time, we've seen that many users are actually willing to expose some build information there. And they were doing that manually. So what we did in 1.4, we added a new ways to doing that. So I'm going to show you this. I'm going to add a new execution to this plugin, and I'll showcase that plugin in a minute. Build info. I'm going to run that. Yep. And if I do, I have some build information exposed out of the box. And you can customize that. You can add more properties. You can do, and the nice thing about it is any build properties that you add, you're doing that in the build system. So you have full control about tokens that might be in your build system. You're just in the same file. And Spring Boot will take care of moving that to the application. OK, so that's 40 minutes, more or less, of coding, adding feature, and showcasing things, and staying in the IDE. No shell script, nothing, no whatsoever. So I'm going to shut down this app, and maybe the question that you have now is, how do I run that stuff in production, right? Okay, so let's run Maven for the first time. I'm going to package the app. So MVN package, you know Maven, you know it's going to build the application. So at the beginning of the talk, I told you back to basics. We're just back to the basic stuff, the most straightforward stuff about Java. So I need to start this app. How do I do? Well, you do this, and the application is starting. OK? So your application now is a single jar file. And within that jar file, we have a layout that we've built, where we embed the dependencies of your application and the classes of your project. and we also bundle a launcher. And well, you can basically start it like that. It's very easy. There's also plenty of things that you can configure. I told you about all those keys. So for instance, if you want to customize the embedded container that we provide, there's a bunch of server properties. So for instance, you can change the port if you want, server.port. But you can also do that on the command line if you want. And that's going to start the application 7070 instead. You can also specify those settings via system properties, command line, OS environment variable, sorry. You can also customize the way it's being loaded. And if you're wondering, yes, you can add your own configuration keys and get this auto-completion. So if you have configuration for your app and you want to expose some best practice and you want others to be able to configure that very easily, it's very simple to have that in the IDE. So the IDE developers, they don't hard code the properties that we expose. They actually read that from something that's generated automatically. All right, so I had plenty of things I wanted to show. So for instance, there is a new testing support in Spring Boot 1.4 that actually brings auto-configuration to your tests. So everything that you've seen so far for production, if you're new to Spring Boot, keep in mind that I haven't showcased that, but the same kind of nice feature, you'll get that for your test too. So, and for those who know Spring Boot, give it a try to Spring Boot 1.4. It's a very nice feature. And I have time for a couple of questions. And I hope you have some.
Is the dev dependency removed when you deploy to production?
Come again?
The dev dependency, the dev tools dependency, automatically removed?
Yeah, so there is basically two ways of doing this. One is DevTools has some sensible check. It will figure out that it's not running within an IDE, and it will disable itself. If you're not sure about that, like for whatever reason you don't trust us, you can actually configure the plugin here, and you can say, and you can do that. You can do exclude DevTools, and when you package the jar file, it will be excluded automatically. I forgot to mention, we also support Gradle. So I did my demo with Maven and IntelliJ IDE. But if you use Gradle STS NetBeans, you'll get the same feature. More questions, please. In the back? No, that's not someone asking a question. Yes.
Sorry. Is there a way to move from Spring Boot application to more traditional Spring configuration? So, you know, to have this template and then
put the mic on, otherwise I don't hear anything.
So now,
is there a way to migrate a Spring Boot application?
Do different directions. So start with Spring Boot and actually see how a Spring Boot application would be configured in a more traditional Spring application. So to get the config and other stuff.
So we don't want you to do that. No, seriously. We don't want you to do that. We want to give you all the tools that you need to actually understand what's going on in the inside, so that you have confidence that what you're doing is the right thing. So if I go back to the app, I probably need to restart it. You have one more thing I didn't show, is the AutoConfig report. And the AutoConfig report is basically a report of things that were enabled by AutoConfig and things that were disabled. So for instance, one of my topic is JMS for whatever reason. And you'll see that I don't have JMS in this application. I'm not using it. I don't have the JMS API, nothing. So you could see that this particular one did not match because this class wasn't found. So you don't have a way to take a Spring Boot application and generate what the configuration will be, because it's very hard to do, and probably it will be completely static. So the way it's code generation again, and we don't want to do that. But we will give you tools to actually figure that out. We are working on a super nice feature, I hope, for 2.0. is to take a snapshot of this report every time you start the app. And when it crashes, we tell you the difference between the last time it started and the time it crashes. So you know exactly what has changed, and you can take action accordingly. Oh, we also do nice things like, you know, I have started the app, and I can start it again on the same port. So you all did that, right? You have an application on 8080. You start an application again on 8080. It blows up with like 200 lines of stack trace. That's not going to happen with Spring Boot, so we have this. We have an SPI to detect the most common mistakes and to show you a nice report like, this is what happens, this is what you need to do. And if you want to add your own, remember I show you with the Earth indicator that you can add your own. You can also add your own failure analyzer if you want. There's one more.
Hello? Okay. Just one question. I noticed that your app is starting very quickly. It's like 5-6 seconds.
Yeah, less than that.
Is it something that you improved with Spring Boot, or?
It's quick and you want us to improve it?
No, I just, I ask you why is that quick? I know when I deploy up, it's like 30, 40 seconds sometimes.
So there's, yes, we've been working on that a lot, but if you take Spring Framework 4, with the same amount of code and the same app, you'll get exactly the same bootstrap time. So there's nothing in Spring Boot that has been built to make it start faster, but we've worked a lot to make sure that the auto-configuration has close to zero impact. So for instance, when all the auto-configuration, what we do is we order the checks so that the faster checks are being run first. So for instance, checking if a class is on the class path is very cheap. So that's what we do first. So back to my case with JMS. If JMS is not there, we'll see it very quickly and we'll disable everything that related to JMS. And we will only run the things that are a bit more costly at the very end to figure out what we have to do. So that's one thing we did. And the other thing we did was Spring Boot becoming more and more popular. We've seen that there was some bootstrap time issues in some applications, and we've actually fixed that in Spring Framework itself. So if you take Spring Framework 4, if you have any issue, and you take Spring Framework 4, you'll get the same performance improvement. Do I have time? No, I don't have time, sorry, but you can come to me and we'll have a nice discussion, I hope. Thank you very much. Enjoy the conference.